Hi everybody, welcome to A Course in Miracles Applied. We are in part 4 of our hero's journey through A Course in Miracles. I just want to briefly recap what we did. So we started out in the ordinary world, which is based on Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. We started out in the ordinary world, which in the Course is the world of the ego. We went to the call to adventure. That is the call from our right mind to call us back home in the Course. The next step is the refusal of the call. We refuse the call to go home. In the Course, there would be a permanent, not permanent, but an ongoing resistance that we have against the call from the right mind, that the ego does not want us to go back to the right mind because it cannot enter our home. It has to stay outside. The next phase on our journey, the next stop on our journey is meeting with the mentor. And in the Course, meeting the mentor is when the Course shows up in our lives, when Jesus shows up. Then we spoke about crossing the first threshold. That in the Course would be the equivalent of us committing to the journey with Jesus and the Holy Spirit to the best of our knowledge, and whenever that happens in our lives. But that is when we kind of the first time when we venture out of the ego thought system for the first time and realize that there's a much bigger world out there, which is not out there but inside, that was hidden from us before. The next stop is called Tests, Allies, and Enemies, and we have discussed this in the section here on YouTube, I think, which was part 2. We spoke about the laws of chaos. The next phase is the approach to the inmost cave and the ordeal that the hero has to go through, and that we spoke about in an earlier recording. I think it was like 6 months ago that I did that, was the obstacles to peace. And the final leg of our journey, which we are doing today, which is in Joseph Campbell's world, is the road back, the reward, the resurrection, and the return with the elixir. And that is summarized in the Course, in our discussion in the real world, which is the end of the journey. So once the hero passed through the Shadowland, and once he has slayed the dragon in the innermost cave, he returns home. Within the journey of the Course, the equivalent would be the real world is what awaits us after we have gone beyond all the obstacles that we have put in place between us and, quote, the awareness of love's presence. That's the introduction in the text. The real world in the Course is not the world we perceive right now. As it says in chapter 13, section 7, the attainment of the real world, it says, "Sit quietly and look upon the world you see and tell yourself, the real world is not like this. It has no buildings and there are no streets where people walk alone and separate. There are no stores where people buy an endless list of things they do not need. It is not lit with artificial light, and night comes not upon it. There is no day that brightens and grows dim. There is no loss. Nothing is there but shines and shines forever." Now, this is very beautiful and very poetically written, but what does it mean exactly? what does it mean when Jesus says there are no buildings? It has no buildings and there are no streets, right? Is it that we won't see any more buildings or streets or people when we're in the real world? Now, for this to make sense, I think we first have to look at what we're seeing right now. I think it takes a long time to realize that what we see is not on the outside. Our identification with the world is so complete that we see ourselves as joined with it in a causal relationship, right? Meaning that the world is there factually. It is a fact that the world is there, and the world causes what we feel and think. And it causes, therefore, how we act. We believe that what we see is reality. We have completely forgotten, really, that we are making up the world whenever we look at it. And lesson 15 says to that, it says, "It is because the thoughts you think appear as images that you do not recognize them as nothing." I know this sounds very convoluted, but it's actually very simple. You think them, those thoughts, and so you think you see them. This is how your seeing was made. This is the function you have given your body's eyes. It is not seeing, it is image making. It takes the place of seeing, replacing vision with illusions. That is in paragraph 1 in the workbook, lesson 15. So how does our seeing work? The ego tells us that the world we look at is outside of us and completely independent of our thoughts, right? The world, as the ego says, imprints on us with whatever happens out there. The world is the cause for how we react. We see what is actually there, the ego tells us, and we trust that what we see is real. We cannot deny this, right? We think what we look at is reality. In truth, how we see things is quite the opposite of what the ego tells us. When we are with the ego, we must believe in our own sin, right? And we are with the ego when we are not in complete peace, with love extending to everything and everyone, right? So for now, let's assume that we are 99.99% of the time with the ego and therefore merged with its thought system as well, 99.99% of the time. Maybe it's less, but I think for purposes of the process, for me, it's always more helpful to realize, okay, I'm in my ego most of the time, right? Because the other part that isn't in the ego, we don't have to worry about it. So when we're connected with the ego, our internal frame of reference is that of sin and of its dire consequences. That is what the ego system is all about, right? Namely, fear, guilt, fear, over having killed God and now being afraid of him, right? Punishment and death. That is what the ego thought system is about, and that is what we inherit every time we are with the ego. Our frame of reference when we are with the ego is our own guilt over having killed God. And this is what we see when we look outside. We see separation, and we see the consequences of our sin. If you look out the window right now, that's what we see. We don't see it directly, right? We see it in a distorted way, camouflaged and veiled. We might see a regular street or a house across from us, or we might see people in a park or on a beach. It doesn't matter. If we're with the ego, we must see through the ego's frame of reference, which is always our own sin and the destruction of heaven. There is no better path within the ego. The ego is built on sin and the destruction of heaven. So when we look out, we must look out through this reference point. There is no other reference point within the ego other than sin and the destruction of heaven. So if we were to see only death all around us, though, we would ask for a better way sooner, right? But because we cherish our individuality and part of us doesn't want to go home, we put a filter on what we're seeing, and we don't see the darkness directly. We see some light here and there in form of a sunset or a path in the woods, a nice park by the river and such, right? But it is never enough to bring us true peace, and only enough to distract us for a while from the bleakness in the world. That bleakness in the world stems from the bleakness in our mind when we're connected with the ego. The Course says the world was made as an attack on God. It symbolizes fear. That is in the workbook, part 2, section 3. So whatever we currently see when we look out of our window is there because we believe we attacked God. And that this attack on God had dire consequences, namely our sin. We attempted, together with the ego, to make a place where God could enter not. And it says that, it says in the workbook, also in the section 3, part 2, it says, thus the world was meant to be a place where God could enter not, and where his Son could be apart from him. So we made a hiding place where we could find guilt on the outside while keeping our individuality intact. And we are now fully identified with the world. But one question remains, really, and that question is, who is the we in this scenario, right? And as Jesus says, who is the you who are living in this world, as he says in the text, chapter 4, section 2. And the answer is, it is us, all of us, as the separated Son of God, who believed the ego's story of its own sinfulness. So, the real world is completely different from ours, because it does not come from the ego thought system. It is the real world is the effect of a completely different way of seeing. And nothing we look on right now resembles it at all. And the reason for that is that what we're seeing right now when we look out of our window is the past. The real world is in the present moment. But we don't have access to the present moment because if we're in the ego thought system, sin is our past, guilt is our present, and fear is our future. This is literally the case. When we're with the ego, we skip the present moment completely. And the present moment is the only time when we can see the real world. It's here right now at this very moment, blazing upon us. But because we look at the world through our own sin, which is in the past, we literally cannot see it. Jesus says, let us be still an instant and forget all things we ever learned, all thoughts we had, and every preconception that we hold of what things mean and what their purpose is. Let us remember not our own ideas of what the world is for. We do not know. Let every image held of everyone be loosened from our minds and swept away. That is in the text, chapter 31, section 1. So if we were to do this, if we were to forget our preconceived notions, our preconceptions, we would see the real world. It is literally beyond words, because words were made to hide it. What we must realize is that our life's purpose, right? Our life's purpose, while we are with the ego, is not to see the real world. That sounds crazy, right? It sounds counterintuitive. But that's what the ego thought system is. It is insane and, quote, the result of a tiny mad idea of corruption that can be corrected. That is in chapter 19, section 4. So our life's purpose, when we're with the ego, is not to see the real world. It would make us weep if we were to look at it. The loveliness of each flower, each person, each rock, and each overflowing garbage can in the city would bring us to tears. The love behind the veil, we laid upon the world is so strong, we would literally fall to our knees if we would see it. Literally. Its magnificence would appear very quiet, completely and utterly comforting, and filled with joy and peace so deep we would have no words to describe it. This could happen while we look at the scene of a war, or this could happen while we look at a small brook of clear water running down into an eddy. The Course says, a miracle looks on devastation and reminds the mind that what it sees is false. That is in the workbook, part 2, section 13. So whenever we look outside of our window, we see devastation, cloaked in bearable imagery. What we see does not induce love in us, if we're completely honest. It can't, for it was made from the denial of love. The real world, on the other hand, stems from our right mind, and from there it extends outward. We see the loveliness of our true self on the outside. We see brothers, and we see the unity of Christ in everyone. And even while we look on devastation and on war. Because war and conflict are solely within our mind, if we have given up the ego, we cannot but see love everywhere. On the flip side, while we look out onto the world and are not weeping over its beauty, whether we're in a dirty New York City subway or watch images of a war, we are with the ego. The Course says, forgiveness turns the world of sin into a world of glory, wonderful to see. Each flower shines in light, and every bird sings of the joy of heaven. There is no sadness, and there is no parting here, for everything is totally forgiven. And what has been forgiven must join, for nothing stands between to keep them separate and apart. That is in the text, chapter 26, section 4. The real world is basically our own world, completely forgiven. This means that the sin we have laid upon the world is gone, And what's left is the beauty of our right mind extended outward. And when we look out onto the world without sin as our frame of reference, that will release the world from the guilt, from our guilt. And once the veil of guilt is gone, what's left is utterly beautiful. This beauty, though, is not seen with our eyes, but with our right mind, who looks but on itself. So, in the section, The Forgiven World, Jesus connects the process of forgiveness to our seeing the real world as a result. And the section begins with this. He says, "Can you imagine how beautiful those you forgive will look to you? In no fantasy have you ever seen anything so lovely." That is in the chapter 17, section 2. So forgiveness removes the veil that we have drawn upon the world. And what is left when this veil is gone is the real world. The truth is, we can't imagine it, right? We have forgotten, completely forgotten. And only a vague memory has stayed with us, drowned out by our insistence that we're happier as an individual than as brothers among brothers. This veil we see across the world, this veil of ugliness that is sometimes looks beautiful, but is in fact ugly. This veil we see across the world is our veil. We put that there. It is not in the world. Separation is not in the world. It is in our mind. Otherwise, we would not see it. As long as we believe in darkness and in separation, in conflict and in war, and as long as we believe those things are in the world, we cannot see the real world. We cannot see the real world. And forgiveness is the process during which we learn take back the projections that we placed upon the world. We take them back to us and reevaluate our own sin with our teacher, Jesus or the Holy Spirit, as our guide. It is our belief in sin that we see in the world. And the real world is really nothing other than what's left when we have withdrawn the projections we have placed upon the world. And now we see the world as it truly is, without the ugliness of the ego thought system laid upon it. Because love is the only reality, that's what's left when all illusions are forgiven. The Course says, "Nothing you see here, sleeping or waking, comes near to such loveliness. And nothing will you value like unto this, nor hold so dear. Nothing that you remember that made your heart sing with joy has ever brought you even a little part of the happiness this sight will bring you." That is in the text, chapter 17, section 2. So this is what awaits us when we are finally ready to decide against the ego. But decide against it we must. And in order to do that, we have to look at it. As the hero of our own journey, we must first look at the laws of chaos and the obstacle to peace the Course describes, right? That's the work. The real world will not just appear one day. We have to take a good look at the ego and then realize that we need do nothing to overcome it. We only need to look at it with Jesus. So here's the crux of this segment, and I think also the crux of the whole Course, right? In order to reach the real world, Jesus asks us a very simple and very powerful question. He asks this question throughout the course in many different words, many different ways. This question is the foundation of the atonement and the very basis of forgiveness. And the question is this, quote, how much do you want salvation? How much do you want salvation? It will give you the real world trembling with readiness to be given you. But how much do you want salvation? There is no more important question than this. How much do we want to see the real world? How much do we want to forgive our brother? Those are the same questions. The real world is ours by inheritance. It is the kingdom of God translated into the language of love we can understand. But we must want it. We must want it more than our individuality. We must want it more than anger, more than judgment, and more than attack. We must want it more than specialness. We must want it above all else. Otherwise, it will not appear. The real world is ready for us right now. Its joy and happiness will radiate outward from us into the world, touching everything and everyone we meet and even think of. It is there for us by right. The process with the Course is for us to learn all the ways we're saying no, all the expressions of us not wanting salvation. And we must look at this first, otherwise we will not be able to decide against it. We must look at our no to arrive at the yes. If we feel angry, upset, hopeless, abandoned, weary, tired, judgmental, annoyed, overwhelmed, frantic, sad, and such, we prefer those to salvation. We want to feel all of what we feel, so we don't get in touch with our wish for salvation. The wish for salvation, our fervent wish to return home, is buried by our choice, by a legion of thoughts and feelings there to cover it up. And the hero of this journey, namely us, must cut through those thoughts and lay bare this fervent wish to return home. He must find this wish, this treasure at the bottom of the well. He must uncover it. This wish in us is the beacon that lights the way home. This cannot happen without pain, unfortunately. Whatever comes up, or whatever covers up this wish to return home, is pain. And it is the pain over leaving in the first place. So our journey to the real world entails uncovering pain and moving through it to our wish for salvation, which lies buried under this pile of pain that we have hidden from ourselves. And this is what we have talked about when we, in the last chapters, when we spoke about the laws of chaos and the obstacles to peace, right? The laws of chaos and the obstacles to peace have as their sole purpose to hide this wish to go home from our awareness. Jesus says, and the pain in this mind is so apparent when it is uncovered that its need of healing cannot be denied. When it is uncovered, we have to let it be uncovered. Not all the tricks and games you offer it can heal it, for here is the real crucifixion of God's Son. we crucify ourselves. And then we hide it. We hide this pain of having crucified ourselves for the seeming attack on God. We hide all this pain under this layer of emotions and thoughts and problems and worldly things, right? It's all there to hide the pain from ourselves, because the pain then, once we uncover the pain, we would get to this fervent wish to return home. The dragon in the darkest cave of our journey is there to guard the fear of God. And behind that fear of God lies our love for him. Behind that pain of having killed, of this knowledge that we think is true, that we have killed God, this pain that awaits in this dark journey, at the end of this dark journey that we undertake. And behind that lies the love of God. The Course says, for still deeper than the ego's foundation, and much stronger than it will ever be, is your intense and burning love of God and his for you, and this is what you really want to hide. We want to hide this fervent wish to go home from ourselves, because we know once we would uncover it, we would be, as the Course says, we would leap back into the arms of God. And the ego cannot do that. The ego cannot follow us back to God. So the ego tells us, do never, ever, ever, ever discover this wish to go home. Never touch that pain that is piled up above it. Because if you do, you will go back home to God and he will kill you. And what it doesn't tell us is that God is not going to kill us. There's only love between God and us, but the ego cannot enter our home. So the ego's fear, it puts onto us, and now we are afraid of God. The laws of chaos in the Course, those 5 laws of chaos that we talked about, have one goal and one goal only: to hide our wish to return home from us. The obstacles to peace have one goal and one goal only, that is to hide our wish to return home from ourselves. The real world will dawn in our mind the moment we want it fully. Nobody else stops the real world from appearing to us, other than our wish not to see it. Now, part of us already wants it fully, right? But we have buried this wish that we just talked about deep within us. That wish to see the real world, that wish to, there's this song, the green, green grass of home, right? There's this wish that we have, this fervent wish to come back to the lawns of heaven, as the Course describes. That wish is buried deep within us. So we want it fully already, but we have buried this wish deep inside a labyrinth of false wishes that we have to discover and uncover before we can go past it. And once we have reached this place in our mind where we can get in touch with this burning love for God, our work is done. As the Course says, for God will take the last step swiftly when you have reached the real world and have been made ready for him. That's in the chapter 17, section 2. When our wish to go home overrides all those petty little wishes of the ego, we are on the golden road. And this golden road is shimmering in the sunlight. The hero returns home. And this road leads directly into the kingdom. Only brothers can walk on it, and the hero who travels on it for a while will only encounter love for anyone on this road is part of his family, dearer to him than anything he could have hoped for. We can call it the King's Road because it leads directly to God. It is paved in forgiveness and therefore shines forever. The sun travels lightly on it for a while. He walks through, quote, quiet views of gardens under open skies, with clear, life-giving water running happily beside them in dancing brooks that never waste away. That is in the course, chapter 20, section 8. And then he sees them. At a distance still, but clear in his vision nevertheless. The lawns of heaven. How he has wept to see them again once more. He thought he had lost them and spent lifetimes searching in vain. But now he can behold them, never to let them out of his sight. And Jesus tells us unmistakably that we are home. He says, your foot has reached the lawns that welcome you to heaven's gate, the quiet place of peace where you await with certainty the final step of God. How far are we progressing now from earth? How close are we approaching to our goal? How short the journey still to be pursued. That is in the workbook, lesson 194. In the end, we will come home bringing everyone with us. We left heaven alone, but we come back united and as one. And then one final word is spoken before we are back at the place we have never left. And the Course says in the epilogue of the clarification of terms, which is the last sentence in the Course, it says, the sun is still, and in the quiet God has given him, enters his home and is at peace at last.